Hey everyone, this is Matt. You may know me as the Indie Reader on Instagram. I've been posting for the last several weeks weekly reading recap update videos on Instagram, but I found that they're getting longer in duration, so I'm going to move these over to YouTube. If folks remain interested in them, I'm going to keep doing them. If not, I might expand it to a monthly reading recap. For those who are following me for the first time, I mostly read literature, modern contemporary literature, as well as literature published from independent presses. I'm also quite interested in nonfiction reading, particularly history and philosophy, so you'll see some of that sprinkled in as well. But without any more ado, we'll get started with my weekly reading update for this week. So, the first book I read this week was The Iron Heel by Jack London. This was a real surprise to me. I picked this book up at a little free library. I knew about Jack London as a novelist, mostly from The Call of the Wild and his other books that are more geared towards teen readers. And I was not familiar with his political work that was geared towards adult readers. And so The Iron Heel is an example of Jack London's adult political fiction. It looks at a group of revolutionaries who are battling against a group of moneyed elites that are called the oligarchy. And it's a kind of literature version of Karl Marx's Capital, the struggle between the elites that are looking to become wealthier and wealthier and oppress the proletariat or the working class people, and the working class fighting back. A lot of the novel takes place in California, which is where some of Jack London's best work takes place, as well as where his political career took place. So he was not only a political novelist, but also quite involved in socialist politics in California. This was a really interesting read. It's very short. It's about 110 pages. If you're interested at all in political literature, if you're interested in socialist literature, The Iron Heel is a really interesting place to start. And it's also an interesting book because it's a dystopian fiction, and it's starting to touch on some of the elements of speculative fiction that we see come to more prominence later on in the 20th century. So it does give a little bit of a preview for some of that combination of literature and genre fiction that we get to see later in the century. This book was published in 1909, so it's very far ahead of its time. So very interesting read. The Iron Heel by Jack London, one of my more surprising books that I've read in 2025. The second book that I finished, and the book that's really been occupying me for the past several months, is The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk. This novel has been sitting on my bookshelf for several years now. It is from one of my favorite authors. Olga Tokarczuk, I think, is a contemporary genius. She won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And The Books of Jacob is considered to be, by many, to be her seminal or best work. And from reading it and from completing it, I can wholeheartedly agree with those other critics. The Books of Jacob is a historical epic that follows Jacob Frank, who's maybe a prophet, maybe a fraud, and his group of followers as they begin their lives and political careers in Poland. And then it follows them as they travel or are forced out of Poland, the Ottoman Empire, and then later the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the ways that they move from a tightly knit Jewish community to converting to Islam, before finally converting once again to Christianity. It's a really interesting case of a group of people that are trying to make the most of their lives and improve their lives from very impoverished beginnings in Poland. And they slowly rise through the classes to eventually become kind of nobility in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's also, like many of Tokarczuk's works, an exploration of gender norms and gender roles. Frank is an abusive man, sexually abusive as well as physically violent. But the women that are part of his follower group, including his daughter Ava, play a very important role in keeping the group functioning. And that their role in the community actually allows them to take on new occupations and learn new skills that allow them to become more and more important as Frank ages and as the center of the group moves from him and his other male leaders to the women in the community. And finally, I think it's a great example of a book that looks at the ways that historical change happens during this period in the 18th century. And so you start off in very impoverished agricultural conditions in Poland, and it moves all the way through until you start to see the Enlightenment coming in, and you see a raising in living standards for your average person. So, a really interesting novel, a very long book. It's about 1,000 pages long. It's a real commitment, but definitely a worthwhile read for anyone interested in historical fiction. It's one of the best historical fiction books I've ever read. I have a PhD in history, so I tend to hold historical fiction to an unreasonable standard of accuracy. And so usually I'm pretty dismissive of it, but in this case, the characters and the world building are so phenomenal that any sort of historical inaccuracies, and there's really good research here, any historical inaccuracies that may exist are just overshadowed by how immersive the world is and how wonderful the characters are to be around. I'd also really recommend this novel to folks that are coming from a fantasy background. A lot of the things that make this book successful are a lot of the things that make fantasy novels so wonderful. They're long books, oftentimes series that create immersive worlds and memorable characters that have kind of magical elements and mystery. And all of that's in the books of Jacob as well. So if you're into fantasy and you're looking to pivot and read some literature, but you're kind of turned off by how short and kind of modern a lot of contemporary literature is, then I think you'll find a lot to like in the books of Jacob, because it is that more immersive world building of a past that feels more like some of the fantasy settings of recent novels. So with those two books being finished this week, I've been able to start two new ones. So the first of the two new ones that I've started is Elias Khoury's Gates of the Sun. This is out from Archipelago Press and is translated by Humphrey Davies. So this is a classic of modern Palestinian literature. It looks at the Palestinian people's experience in the 20th century with the emergence of the Israeli state and increasing ethnic and political tensions between the Palestinian and Israeli peoples. I'm just started on the book, so I don't have too many details about the actual plot points. But so far, about 50 pages in, what really strikes me is the stream of consciousness style of the writing. It's quite beautifully rendered. It can be difficult to follow. You have a lot of different characters that are kind of being blended in together and kind of coming in and coming out. So that's a little bit challenging if you're looking at this purely from kind of a plot perspective of a novel. But I'm guessing that a lot of that's going to kind of coalesce as the novel continues on. But so far, this has been a really exceptional read in terms of writing style. It's quite difficult emotionally. I mean, it tackles a lot of painful topics. Almost the first 50 pages have almost all been about people dying. So if that's something that you find triggering or difficult to read through, you may want to take a pass on Gates of the Sun. But if you're willing to tackle that kind of difficult subject matter, this is pretty immediately rewarding, at least from a writing perspective, because the sentence level writing is quite exceptional. And then finally, a completely different read, which has been on my radar for a while, George Mills by Stanley Elkin. So Stanley Elkin is a writer that has been on my radar for many years. I've actually collected, as you can probably see behind me, several of his novels, but I never actually read one. I'd always kind of focused in on your more well-known 20th century postmodernist and modernist masters, your Gaddises and your Gasses of the world. So Elkins I'd always kind of put on the back burner. But fortunately, some other folks on Instagram have been talking about how great Elkin's writing is. And Chad Post and Adam Levin did a really great podcast recently highlighting George Mills and highlighting Stanley Elkin's work. So I'll drop a link to that under the video. But that got me thinking that maybe it's time to tackle Elkin for the first time. And fortunately, a few other folks in the Life on Books community decided they wanted to read it at the same time. So we've kind of created a group read around it. George Mills, I'm about 75 pages in, so relatively early in. This book is hilarious. It's very, very funny. There's a lot of jokes, like just jokes, not even funny situations, just jokes, which is so different from reading Gate of the Sun or Books of Jacob. Books that tend to be much more serious and kind of dour. So it's really refreshing to read something that's very humorous. There's also just an overall tone that's pretty light and funny. There's a lot of situational humor. I was saying to some other folks, it reminds me a lot of Monty Python in many cases. There's almost kind of visual gags as well that take place in the novel. So it follows this character, George Mills, who works moving furniture for people who are evicted in St. Louis. And it's him looking back on his kind of lineage of all of these other mediocrities George Mills is of the past throughout history. And it's kind of him looking back on his kind of mediocre lineage and looking at how people don't actually improve necessarily, or generations don't actually necessarily improve upon one another. And it's told in a very funny way. There's a lot of horse humor in it. You can probably tell there's a horse on the cover. There's a lot of horse jokes in it. But it's a very funny read. It's got a lot of memorable characters. Elkin writes humor really well. He also writes characters really well. I mentioned in a previous video on Instagram that I've been reading Joshua Cohen's Moving Kings recently. And that book's a little bit of a mess, but one of the really memorable parts of it is how good Cohen is at creating characters, kind of internally conflicted characters. Elkin has some of that same magic. So this book can be a little bit hard to find. I don't really think it's still in print right now, but it's definitely worth looking into and worth picking up. Maybe it will slow down. It is about a 500-page long novel. It's not super short, but it's very funny so far. It reads very fast, and I look forward to talking with the other Life on Books folks about it as we move further into the novel. So that's what I've been reading recently. Comment in the bottom what you've been reading. Are there any books that have really stood out? Are there any new releases you're looking forward to? I'm also going to put some details in there about the in-person book club that I run out of the People's Book in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Our next book club meeting is going to be on December 1st at 6 p.m. We always meet the first Monday at 6 p.m. People's Book, and we're going to be talking about Gate of the Sun by Khoury. The goal of this book club is to highlight independent presses and the incredible work that they put out each year. And so we read a different book from a different independent press each month. And then we highlight books in the future or presses in the future that we want to read, and we vote as a group on what we want to read the most. So if you're interested in joining that book club, it's totally free to join. You can send me a message either through YouTube or through Instagram, or just come. It's free to join. But if you want to get on the mailing list, I do send a little study guide ahead of time if you want to read some supplemental materials or consider some study questions as you read the book. I do circulate those before our meeting. So if you want to get on that mailing list, do let me know and I'll get you included. Thanks for watching my video. Like and subscribe. Hopefully this will be the first of many of these weekly recap videos that I'll be doing. So thanks for watching. Again, follow me at the Indie Reader on Instagram, which is where I still put most of my work out. And I'll catch you next week with another weekly reading recap. Happy reading.